Right. Thank you very much, Undersecretary. We'd like to get into the next session. So for the other panels, what we've been doing is we've been engaging with the panelists, and then towards the tail end, we come to the audience and we ask you a set of questions. But for this one, we'll do it a bit differently, just to also get everyone as engaged and to get as much perspective from the audience as possible. In between the conversations, we'll throw to you. So please have your questions ready. The microphones will be rotating around the room, so we could just make sure we have those ready as well. We'll have questions maybe every few minutes or so to just make sure we get as many as possible. Allow me to please call on stage our panelists. It's my extreme honor to call Ms. Pamela Coke Hamilton, the Executive Director for International Trade Center, on stage. Also joining us on stage from the airport, Professor Dekai, a distinguished scholar, who will also give us a different perspective on a few of these trends that we're noting in the world. Please join us on stage. Are we ready? Ready? We ready? Okay. Me being in the middle means it's we're trying to make the link. Well, no, that wasn't it. We just happened to sit like this. But we're trying to make the link between what's been happening and where we need to look, and what the future of trade is and what is informing that. Professor Dekai recently found out he's part Mongolian. Yeah, we're discovering that today. So I hope you know there's a lot of things that are happening here, and there's a lot of learnings between the last few days that we've been receiving, even within the digital spectrum, that we'll share during the session. Pamela, we'll start off with you. 2019, the world went into a different state. Markets went different, borders were closed, the world turned on its head. The economies that we see now are not what they were in 2019. People had to come back to the drawing board. Different countries experienced the pandemic and different geopolitics differently. We'd like to imagine the International Trade Center also might have gone back to the drawing board, but we'd like to hear from you how different we are now and how aware of some of these factors that come when we least expect.
Thanks. Is this working? Thanks. Is it working? Yeah? No? Yeah? Okay. Well, thanks so much, George. It's really great to be here. And thank you for facilitating and welcome. I know you had a hard time getting here. Yeah, it's working now, right? Okay. I think, none of us could have predicted what happened in the last 3 to 4 years. I don't think any of us saw it. When I went home on March 13th, 2020, we were asked to go home as a test to see if, we'll be back in a couple of weeks. COVID was just going to pass through and we'd all be okay. Needless to say, that didn't happen. And the whole world locked down. And I don't think any of us could have predicted how it would have impacted trade. At the time, we were more concerned with the health issues and, the survival issues. But when we started to emerge from the COVID lockdown, we began to see how difficult and how much the trading arena had been impacted by the pandemic and by what had occurred in terms of supply chains. Because one of the biggest suppliers of input products and even outputs, China, had taken up a basic full lockdown policy, it impacted every other market across the world in real terms. And so what has resulted from that is that it's what I call, strategic reglobalization. Countries have decided, and companies also, have decided to shorten their supply chains in an attempt to build resilience and some kind of predictability into their system. Because failure to do that, I'll give you an example. Things as simple as getting a car. It was taking people 2 years to get a car that would normally take 3 months. Why? Because they couldn't get the inputs into Germany, into the UK to make, these luxury cars that people like to have. Simple things like even clothes. I could not shop. I'm sorry, it's a major issue for me. I could not get any good suits for 2 years because nothing was coming to Macy's. Nothing was leaving, Asia. And so what has occurred as a result is companies and even countries are looking at what they call the nearshoring and friendshoring. They're trying to see how can we de-risk the supply chains in real terms. It's not a wholesale shift, but it's a strategic shift. And it makes it possible, therefore, to balance what could be a new pandemic at any point or another, global catastrophe.
Of course, media has jumped on that quote, strategic reglobalization, but we'd just like to address that. One of the things you addressed keenly was that it's not the death of globalization, but a restructuring. But would like to hear from you, since most of these agreements that were done years ago, even pre-pandemic, are we seeing re-signing of contracts? How tough is that process maybe to restructure? Because we'd imagine we don't want to get into a tougher economic environment when things have already been so tough.
The process is not going to be easy. I mean, these supply lines have been set up for decades, and they've been set up based upon costs. Nobody's going to just pack up everything and move because there happened to have been a pandemic. But what they are doing is when there are new orders and new supplies coming on, there's a shift taking place. So they may not shift what's already happening in real terms. And now that China, of course, has opened back up and so on. But what they're doing is in terms of new supplies, new inputs, new products, there's a shift to countries that are nearer friendshoring because of also the geopolitical crisis, which has now added to the negative impact of the supply chains. So even, for example, in terms of flying over Russia or the capacity to trade or the capacity to cross borders for a landlocked country like Mongolia, that's a significant challenge. And so the strategic reglobalization is a recognition that globalization is here to stay. The way things have been designed in terms of the international trade arena are not going to change fundamentally, but what they are going to change is tactically. How are we going to ensure that we can continue to get the inputs we need? How are we going to ensure that we continue to trade? Digitalization has completely, that's another, we can talk about that for an hour, but digitalization has also completely shifted how trade is also taking place. And that is a huge element of this strategic reglobalization.
And of course, we'll talk about the role that different regions plays, island states, LLDCs, LDCs, so we'll talk about that. How many of us in the room are in e-commerce or the digital space with their business? Yeah, how many of us utilize e-commerce? Yeah, just put your hand up. It's okay, it's not a trick question. All right, so wait, just keep your hands up, How many of us utilize artificial intelligence within those same businesses?
You just don't know.
You just don't know it. So, all right, thank you. So we'd like to make a clear distinction because most of the time when people talk about AI and machine learning and digital, it's almost lumped together. But we need to make clear distinctions so that we understand where we are now and where we're going. Professor Dekai, there was a sentiment that was said yesterday where, now this is where your Mongolian comes out, because they said that the gentlemen were on the stage and they said every year the Mongolian government posts the top 100 companies. And none of them are in the ICT space over the last couple of years. So their goal between now and the next WEDF and possibly in the next coming years is to have at least 3 Mongolian companies in the top 100, showcasing what ICT can do. But there's different layers. So there's that as ICT. There's people that know that if you're not online, your business might die. But then there's an entirely different world that has gone to the other end of the spectrum, which is artificial intelligence and something that's just coding itself to go to space. So help us unpack and not feel like it's too much to understand for small businesses particularly.
Sure, I'm really happy to be here finally. If only artificial intelligence could help the airplanes to get here within 24 hours of when they're supposed to get here. But you know, I think one of the things that is very important to help understand what's happening in AI is that there is a big range of things that people can mean when they say AI. And number one, understand that AI is a field of scientific inquiry, like physics or chemistry or astronomy. And when people say AI, you have to think which different model in AI are they talking about? Because, you know, for example, today you often hear people say, oh, machine learning is AI. AI is just machine learning. That's not true. AI studies different aspects of human intelligence. And so if you think of learning as a part of intelligence, then yes, machine learning is a part of it. But you can have many different kinds of AI models. And neural networks is one way of doing machine learning. And the sort of deep learning transformers, ChatGPT is one way that we build artificial neural networks. But there are many more. And so if people try to confuse you saying, oh, no, AI is just this or that, you know, that's not true. What we are hearing today is just what people have discovered that we've been doing for 5 years in the research field. And next year, what you see is going to make this year look obsolete. So there are many different models. Physics is not defined by Newtonian physics. Physics is not defined by quantum physics. Physics is a constantly evolving field where we build better and better models. And this leads me to the second important conceptual distinction to remember, is there is a difference between people doing AI who are the tool builders. So people in the research labs where we are coming up with the next kind of AI model that replaces today's AI models, versus people who are doing AI using the tools that folks like us have put out there, and you download it and you put your own data in and you train it for a specific application. Versus, still, the people who don't even do that, they just take a model that has already been trained by somebody and they just ask questions of that model, like we're seeing with ChatGPT. Okay? So 3 different levels of, quote, doing AI. And I think when we are looking at the future here, and in many parts of the world outside of you know, Silicon Valley, San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm from, there is a lot that we can think of to sort of skip over some of the harder parts. We are not necessarily going to see places immediately become tool builders at the state of the art at the universities, that takes time. And it's a very important investment for countries to make. I know that personally from when I was coming into Hong Kong. We built the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology from scratch, from the ground up 30 years ago, at a time when Hong Kong in our neighborhood still had shanty towns with no running water or electricity. And across the border, Shenzhen was nothing. And so that is an important investment, but it takes a few decades. And meanwhile, I think that the example that we have seen in internet connectivity is something that is important in telecom, that is important to bear in mind, because what we saw is in many parts of the world outside of the developed West, what happened is that we bypassed installing fixed line telecom infrastructure and we leapfrogged straight to mobile infrastructure. Now, this is extremely important to bear in mind when we talk about IT, because there is, in my mind, very little point right now for many parts of the world to repeat going through 20th century IT. There's an opportunity for commerce, for the regions to leapfrog that in the same way that we leapfrog fixed line infrastructure. Because today, you already have AIs that are able to write code by themselves. You tell in plain human language, here's what I would like you to write, and the AI writes the code. And this is an opportunity for a lot of regions in the developing world to leapfrog the expensive development costs. And I fully expect in the coming several years that by using AI, setting up a platform to do e-commerce will be much, much easier than it was just even 5-10 years ago.
Right. So just to bring it back to some practical examples, one of the other panelists, a lady called Degi, shears sheep and sells the wool, of course, organic fertilizer. And her biggest move now within the next few years is she's going to be at Walmart, and her orders are going to improve exponentially. Doesn't have a digital component embedded much heavily into it, let alone AI. So we'd like to make the distinction that it might be applicable in some sectors, but for some, it plays more of a parallel role, not the main role. But I know we'll come to exactly that. Within ICT, there's a connotation, there's a notion within most organizations and around the world that if a business is not online now, it's going to die. Let's please clarify that, because we still have the ability to, if we focus only on a certain segment, to continue marginalizing people that have been marginalized, people in rural areas, women, young people. But we'd like to make that distinction that maybe a business might not be dead if it's not online, but the preference would be this. Please help us understand that.
Sure, thanks. To speak in absolute sometimes is kind of scary, but it's true. I mean, I was going to make a bad joke, but no, let me not say it. The truth is, if you are not online as a business, whether it is, you don't necessarily have to be doing e-commerce, but you have to begin to use digital technology for productivity. Even if it's as simple as getting your inventory in order, if it's as simple as making your processes more efficient, if it's as simple as becoming more effective in your communication, whatever it is, utilizing the digital space is now a requirement for success and survival. And that, as I said, precludes even going online to sell something. It is utilizing the whole digital revolution to actually transform your business into one that can be effective and also profitable. One of the things that came out of the COVID discussions was that, and our research at IDC, was that 85% of the companies that went online during COVID were able to actually increase sales during COVID, which says a lot. Because it meant that in a way they were forced to do what they were refusing to do prior to COVID. But once they were not given a choice, they went online, they started, using the digital space in a more strategic way, and they were able to actually increase sales. And so the whole concept of going online is not just for the sales process. It's not just saying, oh, I'm going to put something on a platform to sell. It is the actual embedding of the digital revolution in your company, utilizing it as just in the same way you would utilize water for a fish tank. You're not going to do well if you don't.
Okay, thanks for that bit of context. So we've kind of mapped out what that bed looks like. Let's throw the question to the audience. We'd like to engage as much as possible. Please, if you have a question, just raise your hand. Whatever question you have, we have a lot of things to go through. So just, if you have any question on global trades, trends, what different parts of the world are doing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, applicability. Most of the time when one person raises their hand, then other people rush at the end of the session. Feel free. Okay. There we go. All right.
Thank you very much for a great discussion on going digital. My name is Patrick Kagenda from Uganda. I run an entity called Data Care. At times in some of our countries, when there are issues, the quickest thing for governments to do is to switch off internet. And when that happens, it's like oxygen is off for some of us, and the people are basically concerned about the security. At this level, using artificial intelligence, or if we can think, could we think of ways going beyond where we are locked in, but yet still operating in a legal space? In other words, I want to export my service. I'm exporting, I have a client in Mongolia, but my geographical space has been cut off by the local government. How can we work together and say, look, I'm going to do trade, I'm not going to do politics. Thank you.
Okay, do you have another question? Did you ask about bypassing legally? Put it really well. Okay. Another question there?
Thank you, and thank you very much for the interesting insight that you've shared. I don't know whether I should say I have a question or a comment. Based on the remarks from the Undersecretary on restructuring of global supply chains and US moving more towards focusing on the Western Hemisphere, the restructuring of global supply chain. I think the Executive Director of ITC also mentioned it. What are the implications of that, I think, for countries that are much further than the Western Hemisphere? And how do you balance, that strategic approach with the need for, sourcing from other countries that are much further than the US? I think I dare even ask, maybe for organizations like the ITC, what is your case for, involving other countries that are much further than the Western Hemisphere in terms of their development and inclusion in international trade? Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So 2 questions. There's one there, one last one, and then we'll answer those.
Okay, good morning to all of you. I'm Aruna from Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mongolia. So Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mongolia is really leading in terms of how to promote e-commerce in Mongolia in cooperation with other interagency and ministries. So recently we have successfully concluded the e-trade readiness assessment in collaboration with the UNCTAD. So it was very helpful for us. And of course, one of critically ensure that how to do digital transformation, awareness of the digitalization is very critically important, and then it would really help to move to next system. For example, right now we are using the centralized data storage, right? When it comes to the blockchain, this one use decentralized data of the storage of data. So it would be greatly appreciated if you promoted the advantage of using blockchain rather than, that use decentralized, storage of data. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So let's answer those ones first. I think we could kick off with the bit about, because that one can be answered, both panelists, the internet being cut off by local governments, and that in its case then limits growth, but we feel like there's a way to bypass legally, or maybe what the options are in the event that local governments have that inhibition on the internet. Maybe you could take that on, and then we could have maybe some of the thoughts that have gone behind even advising governments as well, please.
So, I think one of the things that is really important to understand is that the infrastructure that we develop for internet connectivity there's, for a large part of the world, cost issues, obviously, for the infrastructure. And then there's discussions about, does somebody have control over that network? And one of the things that I think is a healthy trend has been for some of the suppliers of this sort of telecom equipment to be open to having the systems audited independently. And this is something that will help if we have more open systems, that we can be assured that there are not backdoors and that there are not ways that people can shut off of the internet that are extra legal. And so this is an ongoing thing right now. We are seeing some companies offer that and other companies are not offering that. And so to me, this is kind of the most important thing, is to try to promote external independent verification of the security of the networks.
I love that polished answer. Sometimes it's as simple as there's an election and the internet is just cut off. For things like that. Maybe, Pamela, please, you could just help us with this one without throwing you too much into the deep end. But I'm sure you've had instances where people say, at the time when we need internet the most, there's inhibitions, or one thing has led to another, and we're not able to move within the digital space, but yet we're pushing for a digital economy. So just wrap our minds around it.
I think that's a hard one because governments will do what governments will do. I think one of the ways that I approach it, and I always approach most negotiations like this, because it's a negotiation, is what's in it for you? And the way I look at it is governments need to understand that it's not a cost. It's actually an investment and an opportunity. That if they cut off the internet, they're basically cutting their nose to spite their face. Because at the end of the day, the overall cost to their income, to their GDP, to their government, their reputation is going to be significantly impacted. And so there has to be a kind of communication mechanism to enable governments to understand that doing this for a short-term objective significantly impacts your long-term ability to attract investment, to attract, no business is going to locate there if you're going to cut off internet, whenever you feel like. It affects your stability, it affects everything else. So that's the way I see it, that, you have to be able to, and as businesses, I find businesses, especially in our developing world, do not use their advocacy power as strong as they should. They don't seem to understand their power, and that if they band together and basically tell the government, this is not acceptable, it will not happen.
There was a question that was asked about sourcing from countries farther from the Western Hemisphere and balancing that.
On that issue, I'm a little bit I'm less concerned, because one of the things that I've found and if you do history, you'll recognize that, trade takes its own routes. Huh? Governments can say lots of things, and politicians and others can try to renegotiate trade routes and put in place mechanisms to try to stop the way trade flows. But history shows that trade flows where it wants, and money follows that. And if we take, for example, this new drive for electric vehicles, the green transition, etc., that is going to be driven by minerals and by mineral resources. Who has the greatest amount of mineral resources in the world? It's not the Western Hemisphere. So either way, they're going to have to engage outside of the Western Hemisphere in order to drive this agenda. And it's going to happen. It's already happening. It may not be being announced, but it is happening. And the kind of investment that you're already seeing, even in Mongolia, he talked about signing an MOU here just yesterday, which means that they are engaging outside the Western Hemisphere. There's a lot in terms of Africa. 70% of the world's cobalt comes from one country in Africa. There is an engagement there, and it has to happen. And so I think what is important is for countries, especially in the developing world, to try to ensure that the terms of trade change. That is not, once again, a replication of what has happened over centuries, which is primary commodity exports, and we send everything out and then buy back what is processed. I think what is important during this phase is to ensure that the countries that have the minerals, that have the resources, are also able to benefit from those resources in a real way in terms of their economic development and their human resource development.
Just help, since you mentioned, for example, one of the recent developments that is starting to shake things up in terms of trade, or at least once we get everything right, is the AFCFTA, so the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. We'd like to know within certain circles how this is being received, Africa being the next global frontier that might distort global markets, how this is being received within certain conversations. Just help paint a picture for us, because we know that that will replicate with, let's say, blue economy, with SIDs and different regions also being at the center stage.
Well, I mean, the AFCFTA is probably one of the most significant trade decisions made since the EU, or well, the European Commission, and the decision of Rome. And it is this because we're talking about 55 countries, almost 2 billion people, and resource wealth that is unparalleled. So all of this decision to come together can significantly impact how trade is going to be carried out. But for me, even more importantly, it also is going to impact the levers of power, the geopolitical realities, how Africa is seen across the board, how they're engaging with the rest of the world. And I think that there is a recognition that they now have to engage in a different way. And so you've seen, for example, just in the last 2 years, EU-Africa Forum, you've seen the US-Africa last December, there was an Irish-Africa Forum. I mean, there are quite a few forums that are taking into account the reality of this change and what that means.
All right, and we're seeing pockets of that in different countries also around the world, being a bit louder about the potential. There was a question that was asked on e-commerce and the assessment that has been done here in the country, centralized data storage versus decentralization, and the advantages of how to utilize that. That question was directly to you.
So that's a good question. I think we're seeing still a lot of evolution of that space, and I think that right now there's in some ways the jury is still out. It's very important to separate the hype from the reality, right? And so the blockchain approach is useful for a number of its properties, but the question is, do we really need those properties to spur the development right now? Database technology of the traditional type is very mature, and so if we have reliable data centers, it's not clear that you have to go to the blockchain in order to spur the kinds of activity that we need for e-commerce. So personally, I would say that if there is a ready-made solution, whether it's based on a decentralized blockchain store or whether it's based on reliable central stores, that there is not necessarily, the main objective here should be, does it provide the functionality that you need for e-commerce? E-commerce has been going on for decades now, and the technology for that is quite mature. At the same time that we're keeping our eyes on developments in blockchain, we can also just make use of the existing technology, and instead of waiting several years for the blockchain based applications to mature, to become adopted at the same level. And there's nothing preventing you from migrating eventually from a traditional store to a blockchain-based store if that becomes stable and mature and robust and widespread enough to do it. So that is a very practical recommendation.
Yeah, just keep the microphone, because we'd like, again, to make the distinction and to really understand. We don't want to talk too high level or too technical. We'd like to be as practical as possible. Let's say in the case of the International Trade Center, operating within a set of governing rules, a lot of countries involved, a lot of bureaucracy and policies. Is policy and legality enough to govern AI? Is it in a space where it will just go on its own and do whatever it wants? Anyone within the AI space will do whatever they want? Or how can we utilize AI within such organizations, still within the confines of such legalities?
That's a really good question. Once again, it's very, very important not to get carried away by Hollywood narratives, sci-fi dystopias when we think about AI. The issues that confront us right now, for most of us, they're very practical. They're very on the ground. Robot overlords, the Terminator, or Skynet is not about to come and destroy humanity just yet.
Not yet.
No, not
5 years.
Let's be honest. There is much greater existential threat to the planet and humanity as a species, of humanity destroying humanity than robots destroying humanity. And this is where we should keep focused, because this is why for me, the United Nations and aligned efforts are so important, because understanding each other and helping to look out for where AI is causing stresses, causing polarization, causing misunderstandings, causing bias, that is a far more dangerous thing than robots coming to destroy us. And so to the extent that we can focus on looking at the healthy uses of AI, to the extent that we can focus on what sorts of regulatory approaches might be helpful to
Examples?
reduce bias, to reduce incomplete reporting, because the biggest danger right now, I think, is not so much fake news, outright falsehoods, as it is the decision of the AI algorithms today that power social media and search and recommendation engines. They are deciding what you don't see. They're deciding not just what you see today, a few hundred items, they're deciding which billions of items today, which hundreds of billions of items from the past decades of the internet you don't get to see. And this causes people to only see what they want to see. They don't understand what it looks like from the other side, which is incredibly dangerous and polarizing. And so, what I think is really important is not just laws, because laws, although I'm very active in working with think tanks like TFS, who have been extremely active in drafting the forthcoming European Union AI Act, and work also in DC. TFS is the Future Society, and we work closely with the Future of Life Institute in drafting those regulations. So of course, we do need regulation, but what is most important is to recognize that the rules and regulations, they only catch the most extreme cases. And what is very important, is to recognize that we as humans, that society is held together not only by the letter of the law. If everybody went around only obeying the letter of the law, the rules, society would fall apart. Really, it's all the unwritten rules, the unspoken social norms, the willingness to understand each other from the other side. That's what actually holds societies together. And this is where the emergence of AI in our society has to be coupled with not only laws and regulations, but more importantly, with a cultural mindset shift to understand that we need to promote that the AIs that determine what you see when you Google something, the AIs that determine what gets recommended to you by YouTube or Amazon or Netflix or whatever, the AIs that decide what you see when you open your social media, your Twitter or your TikTok or what have you, those AIs, we need them to show us things as people who are not our own people are seeing them, because that is the only way that we are going to truly fulfill the kinds of missions that the UN is striving to promote.
Right. And of course, if you want a step-by-step or on utilizing AI, I mean, we could always discuss after the session. You're not running to the airport, at least not anytime soon.
That I finally got here. No, I'm staying.
All right, let's get two last questions, please, and then we'll close. Any pressing question? Even from so there's one here. Do we have a last one? We need to look out for. Yeah, one last one there. Okay.
Yes, hello, Professor Dekai. A question to you on the future of work. That's a big topic these days. It's the future of work with ChatGPT, the topic of AI, destroying jobs have been acute again. And so I'd like to hear from you how you see this in the context of countries that are, for instance, in the IT and business process outsourcing business, that are operating call centers, and what you think will happen to these positions.
This is a very tough question. It's a good question. There's no doubt that AI is, currently we see things like ChatGPT, large language models. It is going to displace a lot of traditional jobs. And that is something that we have to really look ahead. How are we going to manage that transition? It's even more disruptive than the Industrial Revolution was. And so what we need to do is we need to think, these are new tools, and these are new tools in the hands of people that previously did not have the ability to scale their work so much. And I've been having conversations almost every day with people asking questions like that. And some of them are artists who are worried about the fact that, these generative AIs are generating really good art. But I had a great conversation yesterday, or whatever it was, on the other side of the world, with an artist who is an oil painter. And she was super excited because she was showing me that, oh, look, my oil paintings, they look like this. And now working together with this AI engineer, we put them through a version of AIs, like Midjourney and other generative AIs. And it produced this, which is a combination of my art and some other influences. And so I think the thing that we need to do is we need to look at how a traditional worker, you mentioned call center workers, might make use of generative AI. Right now, they might only be able to handle 40 calls an hour. But if they had generative AI, maybe they could handle very easily 300 calls per hour. And there will still, in the immediate future, be a need for humans in the loop. If we go farther forward, yes, new kinds of AI might completely replace the need for call centers. That is true. Realistically, what that means is that we will need humans to be gradually migrating to do jobs that are further up the chain. And I think as that happens, it's very important for us to understand what our socioeconomic policies are. Because when we displace the human labor, there has to be a way for the gains in productivity, the gains in revenues to come back to the human workers. And that's a question that I think different societies, different cultures in different parts of the world will find different answers to, because it's very grounded in the cultural aspects of a society. But one of the things I always encourage is for us to be outcome-based. I don't think it's going to be possible to define one rule that fits all. But what we want to do is we want to share this idea that the outcome should be that the gains from the AIs displacing traditional jobs, one, making possible new kinds of jobs that could not have existed in the pre-AI era. Two, how do we transition people to learn how to do that? So education is very important. Three, how do we envision the gradual merging of human intelligence, human cognitive abilities with artificial intelligence? And four, how do we redistribute the gains in wealth back to the population?
So please allow me to chime in, and maybe then we could see what different roles different organizations play. Let me give you a practical example, because within machine learning is that aspect of learning, but a machine cannot learn unless there's data. So ChatGPT, for a lot of people that might not know in the room, in Africa, most of it was developed by Kenyans. And so one of the issues that came up was that there were unfavorable hours, unfavorable pay, being paid about $2, $7 per hour. And if you know about the reason why they decided to even focus on having it in Africa is because there were certain biases. For example, if you're in Asia, if you're in Africa, if you're in different parts of the world, your skin color is different. So what happened before was that whatever you fed in, the results came almost the same. So there's the need to feed specific data in specific parts of the world. So with that though, for all the people that were helping with ChatGPT, there came about the issue that there were very unfavorable work conditions. So with that came now a different set of jobs, what you're saying. So there are now specialists in data entry, data mining, things like that. So there's a new cream of jobs that has come up, and some jobs are going to die. So some jobs are going to die. The role of organizations and governments is to make sure that there's dignified and fulfilling jobs, and some policies stay rigid, where when such interventions come, you say, our people are going to work on this, but they need to be paid fairly and they need to be treated fairly. So I think that's the distinction. Maybe some organizations cannot take up AI actively, but they can help in molding what that looks like. There was a final question from the gentleman there, and then we'll just wrap up.
My question to Professor Decoy, I'm a journalist from India. Is there a worry that younger generation, which already suffers from attention span crisis, because of tools like GPT, they could even stop the little reading they do now and say in the next 10 years, we could see a generation which is less informed? And is that a concern?
That's a very much a concern. And I think there's several aspects to that. The first thing is, it is even more important with generative AI, with things like GPT and other large language models, to think through very carefully this question I raised earlier. That these AIs are making decisions not only about what to tell you, they're making decisions about what not to tell you. And this conversation is not happening in the public, which is very disturbing to me. Because in effect, right now, we're giving those AI algorithms the power to determine what we don't see. It's actually what I call an algorithmic censor. And that is quite dangerous for polarization. And the problem with ChatGPT and other large language models is because they're so easy to use. You ask them a question in whatever language you speak, and it comes back with the answer in that language. You don't even have to look through a list of recommendations from Google or from whatever. And so it's very seductive, and it plays to our unconscious cognitive biases. And it causes us to fall into traps very easily. And so this is something where we working together, and together, I mean the population as a whole has to understand this and recognize the danger. The governments and the regulators and the institutions have to recognize this as something that we have to work together with the public to form sort of guidelines around. And then the tech companies themselves have to be able to implement things to prevent this kind of tunnel vision in the users of the AI systems. So that's one very important point. The second point, though, is this. There have been studies recently surveying employers about what is the productivity of their employees. And they found that the employees that they hired in the last 3 years were far more productive. And what is the reason for that? It's because those young employees have learned to use the online tools. And those are the ones who are most proficient at making good use of things like ChatGPT. And so if you're an employer, do you want to hire an employee who doesn't know how to use those tools? Or do you want someone who is much more productive because they know how to use those? So at the same time as I give the first warnings, also we do need to make sure that our young generation are trained how to make the best possible, most intelligent, most balanced use of these tools.
Thank you. So final point we'll bring to you, Pamela, to maybe help us wrap this up. We had the Ecopreneur competition and the pitching yesterday. We saw about SheTrades in Mongolia being launched. So the case for women and youth in entrepreneurship is being made, and smaller businesses. But we wouldn't want to hear from me. We'd like to know that the future of trade, the future of our global progress is in good hands, in women and young people. But we'd like to hear from you as we wrap this up. What does the future look like? How optimistic are we about the future?
Well, talk about getting set up. Okay, let me just make a couple comments before I go there. I find that older people tend to forget we were young. It's a very annoying thing, you know? And I say this from the perspective of having a 22-year-old son. The issue that, you know, these young kids have no attention span and they're just not focusing and I think we're just looking at, you know, the Kardashians and the selfie generation. But I find these young people, frankly, are more aware, more engaged, and more willing to speak out than any of us were in our time. Frankly, I mean, we keep giving them a bad rap, and I don't think it's fair. I think that they are actually more engaged than we ever were. Yes, there are going to be issues. Yes, the issue of attention span, as I know with my son, is an issue. But I find that they read a lot more and they're aware of a lot more. The fact that he called me and asked me about, you know, why are they searching for these people and there are these 750 people drowning, you know, why? They ask questions, they ask the hard questions, you know. So the second thing I wanted to say about, you know, the whole issue of jobs and whether, you know, the AI is going to basically take away all our jobs. The way I look at AI is the same way I look at when the locomotive was introduced. And everybody screamed, holy murder, what are we going to do? Because, you know, cars are going to disappear because now we have trains and nobody's ever going to drive a car. It's the same, I remember the very first movie I ever watched. It was a little cartoon. I was 6 years old. And I was going to an international school in Jamaica that was built by the bauxite companies. And it was built by the bauxite companies for their children. But our government wouldn't allow their children to go and we couldn't go. So the government said, well, you can build it, but our children will also come. So we went along and had a great time. It was great. But the movie was about John Bunyan. And I don't know if any of you know the story, but essentially it was the story of the man who basically went up against the machine to try to see who could break down the rocks better, quicker. And they went up and John Bunyan won, but he died. And the machine was still there. And the machine eventually did what it needed to do, because that's what machines do. Sometimes we need to be willing to change, and we need to be willing to use the technology and not allow it to kill us by going up against it necessarily, but using it. Yeah? 100 years later, I think we're doing okay. So, having said all that, I think that the future of trade is good. I don't think trade will ever change. I shouldn't say that. I don't think trade will ever go away. I mean, our basic engagement is based on trade as human beings. The reason why, you know, the Mongols, why Genghis Khan did his thing and, you know, went all over the world is about trade. The reason why, you know, I don't know if you know this, but, you know, France traded Canada for Martinique. Why? Sugarcane. Trade follows money and follows opportunity. Once there's opportunity, trade will continue to grow. So the youth, I believe, are doing their thing. They're in good hands and they see where they want to go. Women are stepping up, are taking more ownership for their future, are understanding their role in making the world a better place. And I think as long as organizations like ourselves begin to or continue to work at all the different levels. So for example, we launched a Switch On program, it's a digital program in Zambia, it's a pilot called Switch On. And it's essentially looking at how do we work with countries and firms to really take advantage of this digital space and this digital transformation. So we're working with the government on how to ensure that the AFCFTA protocol, digital protocol, works for them and that they're ready for it. We're working with the BSOs so that they can advocate for their firms to have it connectedness. Because at the end of the day, we can talk a lot of theory about AI and about, but if you're not connected, what's the point? I mean, you can't make a phone call without a phone, right? So the point is we can talk nice theory about AI and chat GPT and so on. The man in the rural shop in Zambia, So at that rate, we're also planning to connect 20,000 firms through these off-pilot grid, off-grid connections through rural shops that actually get people connected. Because there's 33% people connected. That's 65% people who are not connected. So that is the big issue. How do we close that digital divide so that we can move to the next level? But I think trade is good.
I just want to, applaud this sentiment. Many years ago, when I first decided, I'm going to apply this brave new world of machine learning that my PhD thesis was about at Berkeley many years ago. I'm going to apply this to the task of building translation AIs, like Google Translation and Microsoft Translate and Yahoo Translate and so on, because connection between humans is the most important thing. Everything that we can do to use computer technology, IT, and AI especially, to help to connect humans instead of disconnect humans should be our priority. And so absolutely applaud that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please help me give a warm round of applause to our panelists. Ms. Pamela Cole-Hamilton and Professor Dekai, thank you very, very, very much. As we take a picture, I would like to mention the next session. We have Martin Labe, moderator for the moderator for the next session. He's the Tech Sector Development Coordinator at ITC to take on the next session. Thank you very, very much.